really? You're peeping, aren't you? We don't want to hear anything from you, because that's what that obviously means. It's interesting that a woman shouldn't speak, and some churches have taken that and said a woman should not speak or say anything. In fact, if we carry on, we would say that a woman should not preach, because Paul doesn't allow her to have authority over a man. And then in verse 15 of 1 Timothy 2, again, if we are to interpret it literally, a woman is saved through childbearing. That's good news. My wife is born again. See, in all honesty, not even literal interpreters, those who would read Scripture and say one verse literally means that, and the next following verses in the clause, the same instruction, I have not met anyone who would say that a woman is saved through childbirth. Yet, I've met people who would say that a woman is not allowed to speak in church. Isn't that strange? That leads us to an inconsistency in our interpretation of Scripture and lots of mental and theological gymnastics to try and make it work. Now, can I present this to you lovingly before I carry on? Some of you are going to go away and say, Keith is a feminist theologian. I certainly am not. Can I say that? I am not a feminist theologian. But can I present to you that the theology of the 18th century was chauvinistic theology? Can I just say that? As much as we don't want to be influenced by our culture and feminism today, I would have to say that to a certain degree, chauvinism influenced the theology of the 18th century, which carried over into the 19th century. Now, I'm not saying they were wrong. I'm just saying if we interpret a passage literally, we have to interpret the whole passage literally, otherwise it's inconsistent. And we see by this passage we can't do that. Otherwise, Juliet, by having a baby on Saturday morning, has entered into salvation. But then what do we do for ladies in the church who never have children? And how hurtful does that kind of thinking become? Of course, none of us are actually going to say, no, of course, we understand. Everyone enters into a relationship with Jesus personally. So that then means that we would rather interpret a passage with a dynamic interpretation. When I read Scripture, I want to know what is being said then, what is a universal principle that applies today, and what is the historical gap? In other words, what is the principle behind what is being taught rather than the actual words that are being taught? Because if we understand the principle, that keeps us from error. Does that all make sense? This is what we should do when we read Scripture, when we have our own quiet time. And I've only got 7 hours left. So here we go. What do we do then? We look at the evidence within the passage and ask, what is Paul trying to address? We then look at the evidence in the rest of Scripture, and then we look at evidence in church history and what God is blessing today. For if the Lord did not want women to preach, then in China, he would be saving men, for 90% or so of the Chinese church is led by women. Isn't that interesting? The fastest growing church in the world is being led by women. Now, before all you ladies start getting out and jumping up and down and shouting, yippee, and we're going to run around, we're going to preach, we do need some balance to this, don't we? We need to understand. So let's continue. I might be at risk of doing Bible teaching this morning. Let's look at the evidence within the text. We're going to spend most of our time here. And I will probably not preach everything in my notes, but you can certainly get them through Facebook. Evidence within the text. Verses 9 and 10. I also want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for a woman who profess to worship God. What's going on here? Ephesus is the home for the temple for the Greek goddess Aphrodite. And within the worship of that temple, prostitutes would actually be employed. People could go, both male and female prostitutes, interestingly, would be employed, and you could go and relieve yourself in that way there on an altar before the goddess Aphrodite, and you were said to be worshipping. Now, what is interesting is that these ladies were particularly known throughout the Roman Empire. They were talked about in Rome and across the empire for their dripping gold, for they earned a lot of money, their tightly braided hair. In fact, if you visited Ephesus, you would know a prostitute 100 yards away because they were overly dressed in this way. There was a lot of glamour about them. Now, before you husbands go home and say to your wives, that's it, you can't wear any more gold, something like that. Today we might say, don't dress ladies in micro skirts, high heels and fishnet stockings. You can't believe I just said fishnet stockings in church, can you? That's what we might say. What is the message that is being given to women here? Don't copy the world. Don't copy the world. You don't have to. Our femininity, your femininity, trying to be inclusive in my preaching, your femininity is not related to how you dress. It comes from within. For Paul says, I want women to have good deeds appropriate for those who profess to worship God. Does this make sense? Now, none of us would turn around to the ladies here and say, you've got to take off your gold jewelry, would we? Because we want to understand a passage dynamically. Let's carry on. Let's get to the juicy bits, shall we? A woman should learn. In quietness and full submission, I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man. She must be silent. Any of the men enjoying this yet? Let me just say this, men. I believe in the priesthood and of the home, and I believe that is vested in men. I really do. I believe a man, I'm off my notes, but if we do a men's evening, you might hear me teach on this. I believe a man imitates Christ's likeness to his wife, and therefore is a prophet, priest, and king in the home. That means as a prophet that he speaks words of wisdom into the family home, that he becomes a thermostat. As a priest, he intercedes for his family and stands before God day and night asking for them. And as a king, he has the final governmental role, not to subjugate the woman, but to enhance her life and to present her one day before God as the prize. Does that make sense? That was a little bit for men. So if you're going to go away now and say, right, well, don't get uppity ideas, my darling. But one of the biggest things I had to learn as a married man, and I learned it early on in my marriage, was that God could speak to me through my wife. Some of you men can't believe that. Some of you women are astounded. That is the truth. Because when I got married, I did not believe that God could, based on these kind of scriptures. Now, interesting. And God actually had to show me that he could speak to me through Barbie. And he does. Not solely, but he does. So what's going on here then? Why? Let's go back to our text. A woman should learn in quietness. We know from what I've already said and what we've already expounded on that women were being influenced by false teachers who were men going around promoting Gnosticism, a secret knowledge, and the people they were peaking on. You see, an attack of the enemy doesn't just come straight to the leadership of a church. It will actually come through those on the fringes, through those who don't have any friends in the church. And so you find that they get invited around, they start inviting these speakers, they start talking to them, oh, that's the message, and they fill up women in the text with these ideas, so that actually what was happening was that Paul had to clamp down on it. For what would happen in a typical service in those days is that because they had no PA or microphone, the men would sit at the front. The women would sit at the back. Why did the men sit at the front? Because they were being taught. They were the ones who were to carry the teaching back into the home and so on and so forth. So they were being taught, they couldn't miss a word. The women would sit at the back. What's happening is the woman would start murmuring, or individual women would start murmuring, getting up and saying, actually, Prophet so-and-so says this, Pastor. That's wrong. I've been watching my God TV in Ephesus with my little satellite dish, and that can't be right. And I know that because I had a cup of tea with him, and actually I've been going to house, and I've been talking with the other churches, and they agree with me. So you're wrong, Pastor. And what does Paul say in response to this? Shut up.